नमस्कार दोस्तों, क्या हाल है आप सभी लोगों के। आशा करता हूँ आप लोग बहुत ही अच्छे से होंगे और हेल्दी एंड फिट होंगे और मज़े ले रहे होंगे ज़िंदगी के। दोस्तों, तो आप लोगों के रीडिंग के समस्याओं को दूर करेगा कौन? मैं। आप लोगों को रीडिंग से बोर होने से बचाएगा कौन? मैं। आप लोग सोफे पे आराम से लेट के रीडिंग आराम से बिना बुक के एक्चुअल रीडिंग किए हुए भी रीडिंग का मज़ा ले सकें, इसको इंश्योर करेगा कौन? मैं। आप लोग दोस्तों रीडिंग की बिल्कुल चिंता ना करें, मैं हूँ तो आपके रीडिंग में दिक्कत नहीं आएगी। पूरी एनसीईआरटी आपको ऊपर से नीचे तक स्कैन करवा दूंगा दोस्त, याद रखना एकदम, ये मेरा प्रॉमिस है दोस्त। ऊपर से नीचे तक एनसीईआरटी स्कैन हो जाएगी और आप लोग आराम से कोई भी क्वेश्चन का आंसर दे सकोगे। सारे सही सही चीज़ें मैं आपको एनसीईआरटी में यहाँ पर रीड करवा दूंगा इनडायरेक्टली, मतलब मैं आपके लिए रीड कर दूंगा, आप लोग बस सुन लेंगे आराम से। मैं बता रहा हूँ दोस्त, अगर आप 5-6 बार इन्हीं वीडियोज़ को आराम आराम से देख लेंगे 2-3 दिन के गैप पे, तो आपको एनसीईआरटी इतने अच्छे से आ जाएगी ना, मतलब आप एनसीईआरटी एक तरीके से आपके दिमाग में प्रिंट हो जाएगी। आपको पता रहेगा कि ये क्वेश्चन का आंसर इस पेज नंबर, इस चैप्टर के इस पेज पे है। ठीक है दोस्त, चलिए तो बिना किसी विलम्ब के शुरू करते हैं। आज हम लोग करने आ रहे हैं क्लास सिक्स्थ, क्या बोल रहा हूँ भाई मैं, सॉरी। आज हम लोग करने आ रहे हैं क्लास 8th के चैप्टर नंबर 6 की रीडिंग, जो कि है हिस्ट्री का चैप्टर, जिसका नाम है वीवर्स, आयरन स्मेल्टर्स एंड फैक्ट्री ओनर्स। ठीक है दोस्त, चलिए। और एक बात बता दूँ दोस्त, मैं नोट्स नहीं लिखवाता और ना ही आपको समझाता हूँ चैप्टर, मैं केवल आपके लिए रीडिंग करता हूँ। ठीक है। फिगर 1, ट्रेडिंग शिप्स ऑन द पोर्ट ऑफ सूरत इन द 17th सेंचुरी। सूरत इन गुजरात ऑन द वेस्ट or coast of India was one of the most important ports of the Indian Ocean trade. Dutch and English trading ships began using the port from the early 17th century. Its importance declined in the 18th century. This chapter tells the story of the crafts and industries of India during British rule by focusing on two industries, namely textiles and iron and steel. Both these industries were crucial for the industrial revolution in the modern world. Mechanized production of cotton textiles made Britain the foremost industrial nation in the 19th century, and when its iron and steel industry started growing from the 1850s, Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world. ये आपको मुंबई क्या बोलते हैं, सूरत पोर्ट दिखा रखा है दोस्तों, है ना। चलिए, वर्कशॉप ऑफ द वर्ल्ड ब्रिटेन को बोला जाने लगा। द इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन ऑफ ब्रिटेन हैड अ क्लोज कनेक्शन विद द conquest and colonization of India. You have seen in chapter 2 how the English East India Company's interests how the English East India Company's interest in trade led to occupation of territory and how the pattern of trade changed over the decades. In the late 18th century, the company was buying goods in India and exporting them to England and Europe, making profit through this sale. With the growth of industrial production, British industrialists began to see India as a vast market for their industrial products, and over time manufactured goods from Britain began flooding India. How did this affect Indian crafts and industries? This is the question we will explore in this chapter. Indian textiles and the market. Let us look at the textile production. Around 1750, before the British conquered Bengal, India was by far the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. Indian textiles had long been renowned both for their fine quality and exquisite craftsmanship. They were extensively traded in Southeast Asia, Java, Sumatra, and Penang, and West and Central Asia. From the 16th century, European trading companies began buying Indian textiles for sale in Europe. Memories of this flourishing trade and the craftsmanship of Indian weavers is preserved in many words still current in English and other languages. It is interesting to trace the origin of such words and see what they tell us. Patola weave, mid 19th century. Patola was woven in Surat, Ahmedabad, and Patan. Highly valued in Indonesia, it became part of the local weaving tradition there. ये दोस्तों देख सकते हैं आप लोग, पटोला वीव, है ना। Words tell us histories. European traders first encountered fine cotton cloth from India carried by Arab merchants. In Mosul and in Mosul in present day Iraq. So they began referring to all finely woven textiles as muslin, a word that acquired wide currency. When the Portuguese first came to India in search of spices, they landed in Calicut on the Kerala coast in southwest India. The cotton textiles which they took back to Europe along with the spices came to be called calico, derived from Calicut, and subsequently calico became the general name for all cotton textiles. There are many other words which point to the popularity of Indian textiles in Western markets. In figure 3 you can see a page of an order book that English East India Company sent to its representatives in Calcutta in 1730. The order that was for 5,89,000 pieces of cloth. Browsing through the order book, you would have seen a list of 98 varieties of cotton and silk cloths. These were known by their common name in the European trade as piece goods, usually woven cloth pieces that were 20 yards long and 1 yard wide. Figure 3, a page from an order book of the East India Company 1730 दिखा रखा है दोस्तों. Notice how each item in the order book was carefully priced in London. These orders had to be placed 2 years in advance because this was the time required to send orders to India, get the specific cloths woven and shipped to Britain. Once the cloth pieces arrived in London, they were put up for auction and sold. Now look at the names of the different varieties of cloth in the book. Amongst the pieces ordered in bulk were printed cotton cloths called chintz, kosais or khassa and bandana. Do you know where the English term chintz comes from? It is derived from the Hindi word chint, a cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. From the 1680s, there started a craze for printed Indian cotton textiles in England and Europe, mainly for their exquisite floral designs, fine texture and relative cheapness. Rich people of England, including the Queen herself, wore clothes of Indian fabric. Similarly, the word bandana now refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf for the neck or head. Originally, the term derived from the word bandhana, Hindi for tying, and referred to a variety of brightly colored cloth produced through a method of tying and dyeing. यहाँ क्या देखते हैं दोस्तों, जामदानी वीव, अर्ली 20th century. Jamdani is a fine muslin on which decorative motifs are woven on the loom, typically in grey and white. Often a mixture of cotton and gold thread was used, and in the cloth in this picture. The most important centers of Jamdani weaving were Dhaka in Bengal and Lucknow in the United Princess. ठीक है दोस्तों, चलिए. Printed design on fine cloth chintz produced in Masulipatam, Andhra Pradesh, mid 19th century. This is a fine example of the type of chintz produced for export to Iran and Europe. There were other cloths in the order book that were noted by their place of origin. Kasim Bazar, Patna, Calcutta, Odisha, Charpur. The widespread use of such words show how popular Indian textiles had become in different parts of the world. Bandana design, early 20th century. Notice the line that runs through the middle. Do you know why? In this odhani, 2 tie and dye silk pieces are seamed together with gold thread embroidery. Bandana patterns were mostly produced in Rajasthan and Gujarat. ये देखिए दोस्तों, यहाँ पे दिखा रखा है. Indian textiles in European markets. By the early 18th century, worried by the popularity of Indian textiles, wool and silk makers in England began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles, chintz, in England. Interestingly, this act was known as the Calico Act. At this time, textile industries had just begun to develop in England. Unable to compete with Indian textiles, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by preventing the entry of Indian textiles. The first to grow under the government protection was the calico printing industry. Indian designs were now imitated and printed in England on a white muslin or plain unbleached Indian cloth. Competition with Indian textiles also led to a search for technological innovation in England. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kaye, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. Cloth could now be woven in immense quantities and cheaply too. Spinning jenny, a machine by which a single worker could operate several spindles onto which thread was spun. When the wheel was turned, all the spindles rotated. However, Indian textiles continued to dominate world trade till the end of the 18th century. European trading companies, the Dutch, the French, and the English, made enormous profits out of this flourishing trade. These companies purchased cotton and silk textiles in India by importing silver. But as you know, in chapter 2, when the English East India Company gained political power in Bengal, it no longer had to import precious metal to buy Indian goods. Instead, they collected revenues from peasants and zamindars in India and used this revenue to buy Indian textiles. Figure 7. A sea view of the Dutch settlement in Cochin, 17th century. As European trade expanded, trading settlements were established at various ports. The Dutch settlements in Cochin came up in the 17th century. Notice the fortification around the settlement. Where were the major centers of weaving in the late 18th century? ये दिखा रखा है दोस्तों यहाँ पे, प्लेन वाइट, चेक्स एंड स्ट्राइप्स, छिंड्स, सिल्क. ये सब के कौन कौन से सेंटर्स थे दोस्तों, आप लोग को यहाँ पे दिखा रखा है. आप लोग इसको आराम से मैप जरूर देखें दोस्तों, ठीक है, याद रखिएगा. वीविंग सेंटर्स 1500 to 1750. If you look at the map, you will notice that textile production was concentrated in 4 regions in the early 19th century. Bengal was one of the most important centers. Located along the numerous rivers in the delta, the production centers in Bengal could easily transport goods to distant places. Do not forget that in the early 19th century, railways had not developed and roads were only just beginning to be laid on an extensive scale. Dhaka in eastern Bengal, now Bangladesh, was the foremost textile center in the 18th century. It was famous for its mulmal and jamdani weaving. If you look at the southern part of India in the map, you will see a second cluster of cotton weaving centers along the Coromandel coast, stretching from Madras to northern Andhra Pradesh. On the western coast, there were important weaving centers in Gujarat. इधर है दोस्तों, इधर बंगाल में, इधर वाला ईस्टर्न कोस्ट कोरोमंडल कोस्ट पे है, ठीक है, इसे आप लोग देख सकते हैं, ठीक है. प्लेन वाइट, तो प्लेन वाइट देख लीजिए, स्टार जहाँ पे है, कलकत्ता हो गया, पटना हो गया, डक्का हो गया, पेटाबोली हो गया, मद्रास, पौंडीचेरी, नेगापट्टम, ठीक है. ऐसे ये वाला मैं आप लोग जरूर देख लें दोस्तों, काम आ सकता है आपको, एग्जाम में पूछ सकता है मैप पॉइंटिंग में. Who were the weavers? Weavers often belonged to communities that specialized in weaving. Their skills were passed from one generation to the next. The Tanti weavers of Bengal, the Julahas or Momin weavers of North India, Sale and Kaikollar and Devangs of South India are some of the communities famous for weaving. The first stage of production was spinning, a work done mostly by women. The charkha and the takli were household spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charkha and rolled on the takli. When the spinning was over, the thread was woven into cloth by the weaver. In most communities, weaving was a task done by men. For colored textiles, the thread was dyed by the dyer, known as rangreis. For printed cloth, the weavers needed the help of specialist block printers known as chipigars. Handloom weaving and the occupations associated with it provided livelihood for millions of Indians. A Tanti weaver of Bengal, painted by the Belgian painter Solvins in the 1790s. The Tanti weaver here is at work in the pit loom. Do you know what a pit loom is? The decline of Indian textiles. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India in several ways. First, Indian textiles now had to compete with British textiles in the European and American markets. Second, exporting textiles to England also became increasingly difficult since very high duties were imposed on Indian textiles imported into Britain. By the beginning of the 19th century, English made cotton textiles successfully ousted Indian goods from their traditional markets in Africa, America, and Europe. Thousands of weavers in India were now thrown out of employment. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. English and European companies stopped buying Indian goods and their agents no longer gave out advances to weavers to secure supplies. Distressed weavers wrote petitions to the government to help them. Orang, a Persian term for a warehouse, a place where goods are collected before being sold, also refers to a workshop. ठीक है, तो ये सब है सोर्स वगैरह दे रखा है दोस्तों, आप लोग सोर्स वगैरह खुद ही से पढ़ें, ठीक है, क्योंकि उतने ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है नहीं. पढ़ने का मन करे तो पढ़ा ले, नहीं पढ़ने का मन करे तो उतना ज़्यादा ना पढ़ें. अगर स्कूल में पढ़ाया जा रहा है तो ठीक है, नहीं पढ़ाया जाए तो कोई बात नहीं, या ट्यूशन में पढ़ाया जा रहा है तो ठीक है, नहीं पढ़ाया जा रहा तो कोई बात नहीं. ठीक है दोस्त, चलिए मैं आपको वही पढ़ा रहा हूँ जो एग्जाम पर्सपेक्टिव से ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट होता है. ठीक है, but worse was still to come. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. In fact, by the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. In fact, by the 1880s, 2/3 of all the cotton cloths worn by Indians were made of cloth produced in Britain. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton thread were rendered jobless. Handloom weaving did not completely die in India. This was because some types of cloths could not be supplied by machines. How could machines produce saris with intricate borders or cloths with traditional woven patterns? These had a wide demand not only amongst the rich but also amongst the middle classes. Nor did the textile manufacturers in Britain produce the very coarse clothes used by the poor people in India. You must have heard of Solapur in western India and Madura in South India. These towns emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. Later, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use hand-spun and hand-woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. The charkha came to represent India, and it was put at the center of the tricolor flag of the Indian National Congress, adopted in 1931. What happened to the weavers and spinners who lost their livelihood? Many weavers became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work, and yet others went out of the country to work in plantations in Africa and South America. Some of these handloom weavers also found work in the new cotton mills that were established in Bombay, now Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Solapur, Nagpur and Kanpur. Cotton mills come up. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. From the early 19th century, Bombay had grown as an important port for the export of raw materials, for the export of raw cotton from India to England and China. It was close to the vast black soil tract of western India where cotton was grown. When the cotton textile mills came up, they could get supplies of raw material with ease. Workers in a cotton factory circa 1900, photographed by Raja Deen Dayal. ये देखिए दोस्तों यहाँ पर. Most workers in the spinning departments were women, while workers in the weaving departments were mostly men. ये पिक्चर 10 में दिखा रखा है आप लोगों दोस्तों, ठीक है, फिगर 10. ये वीविंग क्या दिखा रहा है, क्या है ये, हाँ, कॉटन फैक्ट्री. Smelting, the process of obtaining a metal from rock or soil by heating it to a very high temperature or of melting objects made from metal in order to use the metal to make something new. By 1900, over 84 mills started operating in Bombay. Many of these were established by Parsi and Gujarati businessmen who had made their money through trade with China. Mills came up in other cities too. The first mill in Ahmedabad was started in 1861. A year later, a mill was established in Kanpur in the United Provinces. Growth of cotton mills led to a demand for labor. Thousands of poor peasants, artisans, and agricultural laborers moved to the cities to work in the mills. In the first few decades of its existence, the textile factory in India faced many problems. It found it difficult to compete with the cheap textiles imported from Britain. In most countries, governments supported industrialization by imposing heavy duties on imports. This eliminated competition and protected infant industries. The colonial government in India usually refused such protection to local industries. The first major spurt in the development of cotton factory production in India, therefore, was during the First World War, when the textile imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. The sword of Tipu Sultan and Wood's steel. We begin the story of Indian steel and iron metallurgy by recounting the famous story of Tipu Sultan, who ruled Mysore till 1799, fought 4 wars with the British, and died fighting with his sword in his hand. Tipu's legendary swords are now part of valuable collections in museums in England. But do you know why the sword was so special? The sword had an incredibly hard and sharp edge that could easily rip through the opponent's armor. This quality of the sword came from a special type of high carbon steel called woods, which was produced all over South India. Wood steel, when made into swords, produced very sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. This pattern came from very small carbon crystals embedded in the iron. Francis Bachanan, who toured through Mysore in 1800, a year after Tipu Sultan's death, has left us an account of the technique by which wood steel was produced in many hundreds of smelting furnaces in Mysore. In these furnaces, iron was mixed with charcoal and put inside small clay pots. Through an intricate control of temperatures, the smelters produced steel ingots that were used for sword making, not just in India but in West and Central Asia too. Tipu's sword, made in the late 18th century, written with gold on the steel handle of Tipu's sword, were quotations from the Quran with messages about victories in war. Notice the tiger head towards the bottom of the handle. ये देखिए यहाँ पे दिखा रखा है दोस्तों, ये वाला था टीपू sword. Woods is an anglicized version of the Kannada word ukku, Telugu hukku, and Tamil and Malayalam urukku, meaning steel. Indian wood steel fascinated European scientists. Michael Faraday, the legendary scientist and discoverer of electricity and electromagnetism, spent 4 years studying the properties of Indian woods, 1818 to 1822. However, the wood steel making process, which was so widely known in South India, was completely lost by the mid-19th century. Can you guess why this was so? The swords and armor making industry died with the conquest of India by the British, and imports of iron and steel from England displaced the iron and steel produced by craftspeople in India. Abandoned furnaces in villages. Production of wood steel required a highly specialized technique of refining iron, but iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of the 19th century. In Bihar and central India in particular, every district had smelters that used local deposits of ore to produce iron, which was widely used for the manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun-dried bricks. The smelting was done by men while women worked the bellows, pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. Bellows, a device or equipment that can pump air. आयरन स्मेल्टर्स ऑफ पलामू बिहार, ये दिखा रखा है दोस्तों, पलामू, आयरन स्मेल्टर्स ऑफ पलामू बिहार, ये यहाँ पे दिखा रखा है दोस्तों. A village in central India where the Agariyas, a community of iron smelters lived. ये देख सकते हैं दोस्तों यहाँ पे. Some communities like the Agariyas specialized in the craft of iron smelting. In the late 19th century, a series of families devastated the dry tracts of India. In central India, many of Agariya iron smelters stopped work, deserted their villages and migrated looking for some other work to survive the hard times. A large number of them never worked their furnaces again. By the late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? One reason was the new forest laws that you have read about in chapter 4. When the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserved forests, how could the iron smelters find wood for charcoal? Where could they get iron ore? Defying forest laws, they often entered the forests secretly and collected wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Iron smiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters. By the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition. Iron and steel factories come up in India. This year was 1904. In the hot month of April, Charles Weld, an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of Jamshedji Tata, were traveling to Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for sources of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamshedji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India. But this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. One day, after traveling for many hours in the forests, Weld and Dorabji came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the Agariyas. When asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agariyas pointed to a hill in the distance. Weld and Dorabji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forests. On exploring the hill, the geologist declared that they had at last found what they had been looking for. Rajara Hills had one of the finest ores in the world. Slag heaps, the waste left when smelting metal. But there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running the factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. However, the Agariyas helped in the discovery of a source of iron ore that would later supply the Bhilai steel plant. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha to set up the factory and an industrial township. Jamshedpur. Here there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company (TISCO) that came up began producing steel in 1912. TISCO was set up at an opportune time. Although all through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Figure 14, the Tata Iron and Steel Factory on the banks of the river Subarnarekha, 1940. ये दिखा रखा है दोस्तों फैक्ट्री. अच्छा, टाटा आयरन एंड स्टील फैक्ट्री ये वाला है दोस्तों, ठीक है. एक्सपेंशन ऑफ द रेलवेज इन इंडिया हैड प्रोवाइडेड अ ह्यूज मार्केट फॉर रेल्स दैट ब्रिटेन प्रोड्यूस्ड. फॉर अ लॉन्ग वाइल British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. By the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of the war in Europe. So imports of British steel into India declined dramatically, and the Indian railways turned to TISCO for supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, TISCO had to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. Over time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. Expansion at the end of the war. To meet the demands of the war, TISCO had to expand its capacity and extend the size of its factory. The program of expansion continued after the war. Here you see new powerhouses and boiler houses being built in Jamshedpur in 1919. ये देखिए दोस्तों, October 1919. In the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, industrial expansion occurred only when British imports to India declined and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. This happened during the First World War and after. As the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger, the demand for government protection became louder. Struggling to retain its control over India, the British government had to concede many of these demands in the last decades of colonial rule elsewhere. Early years of industrialization in Japan. The history of industrialization in Japan in the late 19th century presents a contrast to that of India. The colonial state in India, keen to expand the market for British goods, was unwilling to support Indian industrialists. In Japan, the state encouraged the growth of industries. The Meiji regime, which assumed power in Japan in 1868, believed that Japan needed to industrialize in order to resist Western domination. So it initiated a series of measures to help industrialization. Postal services, telegraph, railways, steam-powered shipping were developed. The most advanced technology from the West was imported and adapted to the needs of Japan. Foreign experts were brought to train Japanese professionals. Industrialists were provided with generous loans for investment by banks set up by the government. Large industries were first started by the government and then sold off at cheap rates to business families. In India, colonial domination created barriers to industrialization. In Japan, the fear of foreign conquest spurred industrialization, but this also meant that the Japanese industrial development from the beginning was linked to military needs. हो गया दोस्तों कंप्लीट ये चैप्टर. अब आप मज़े कीजिए. कितने मिनट में हम लोगों ने कंप्लीट कर लिया चैप्टर? 34 मिनट्स पक्का. 34 मिनट्स में दोस्तों ये चैप्टर का रीडिंग हो गया कंप्लीट और आप लोग मस्ती कर सकते हैं. अब देख रहे हैं ना दोस्तों किस तरीके से आपका रीडिंग 35 मिनट्स के अंदर हो जा रहा है. हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है भाई? बिल्कुल बोलो हाँ. सोचो जो चैप्टर आप पढ़ने में 4-5 दिन 7-8 दिन लगा देते हो, वो चैप्टर मैंने आपको बस 34 मिनट में पढ़ा दिया. आप लेट के इसको आराम से सुन लें और हर 2-2 दिन के बाद इसका रिपीट टेलीकास्ट फास्ट स्पीड पे देखते जाएं दोस्तों. आपके दिमाग में प्रिंट होना एनसीईआरटी शुरू हो जाएगा. ठीक है दोस्त. और जब तक याद नहीं और जब तक प्रिंट नहीं होता तब तक सुने. और एक बार सुनने के बाद उसके बाद आप क्वेश्चन आंसर याद करेंगे ना तो आपको बहुत आसानी मिलेगा. और 2 बार सुनने के बाद याद करेंगे और आसानी मिलेगा. मज़ा आ जाएगा दोस्त आपको रीडिंग सुनने में. ठीक है. तो आशा करता हूँ कि मैं आपकी मदद कर पा रहा हूँ दोस्तों। आप लोगों को वीडियो पसंद आ रहा है तो आप लोग लाइक शेयर और सब्सक्राइब और शेयर करके मेरा उत्साह ज़रूर बढ़ाएं। और मिलते हैं आपसे नेक्स्ट वीडियो में। थैंक यू एंड हैव अ नाइस डे। मेरे बेस्ट विशेष हमेशा आपके साथ रहते हैं दोस्तों। मिलते हैं नेक्स्ट वीडियो में। थैंक यू।